Today on the PIO Podcast, we'd like to introduce Stephen Kuhr of the Kuhr Group. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for the invitation, Bob.
Steve, you've got a really varied background and a lot of experience over your years. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about your background?
I started in EMS in New York City, 1980. I actually was a volunteer EMT before that. But in 1980, I joined the New York City Emergency Medical Service as an EMT. Quickly became a paramedic. Training was made available through EMS at the Albert Einstein Medical School, Albert Einstein University Medical College up in the Bronx, and worked the streets of Brooklyn, the nitty-gritty streets of Brooklyn as a ground-pounding paramedic for several years before starting to achieve rank lieutenant. Captain, joined the Special Operations Division, which was essentially a mass casualty management division within EMS. Specially trained officers would go out and ensure scene safety and manage and coordinate major emergencies. Rose to the rank of deputy chief. I was a division commander in Manhattan, Queens, and the Bronx at different times. And around 1996, which is kind of a boom year of changes in public safety in New York City, the New York City Fire Department, New York City EMS merged into a single agency. So I retained my rank as deputy chief. And shortly thereafter, the mayor created the Office of Emergency Management, and I was fortunate enough to be asked to join as a charter member and one of the founding members of the leadership team.
Wow, outstanding. So being that you've been there through everything, through the first World Trade bombing and then and so on and so on. So you've definitely seen your fair share of things.
I was at the first World Trade Center bombing. I was mutual aid coordinator. My job was to, as part of the incident command team, was to receive, catalog, and deploy the incoming EMS resources that were coming in from Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Jersey, Long Island, all the surrounding states and local communities. We had victims treated and transported that day. Inclusive in that number were 6 fatalities.
Wow, amazing, absolutely amazing. So, Stephen, can you talk to you had a different job later on, and so I want to talk about some of the differences here that serving as a director of emergency management at the Colorado Springs Utilities versus being deputy commissioner for New York City Office of Emergency Management. What were the differences?
They were both incredible jobs, and they were both, as much as they were very similar, they were different. So as an emergency manager in a community setting, I mean, do you think of New York City as a community or hundreds of communities? But for this discussion, the emergency manager for a community or a city, as it were, is responsible for risk mitigation, disaster preparedness, emergency operations, and recovery for major emergencies for a population. And in that case, the population being the city of New York. At the time I was deputy commissioner there, population was 8.5 million resting, and that goes to 12 million during the workday, if you think about the commutation of the rush hours. So that was I was already in the fire department and EMS work. It was all very familiar to me, but it was a growth opportunity beyond anything I could have imagined. Working as an emergency manager for a critical infrastructure organization is different yet similar because you serve a population, or if you will, a customer base. Colorado Springs Utilities, unlike other utilities, is a single utility serving a population of about 500,000. Single utility meaning they provide electricity, natural gas, water, and wastewater services, some other services as well, like street lights and stuff like that, to the population, primarily to Colorado Springs, which is the second largest city in Colorado, but also to some of the suburban communities outside the city in El Paso County. So even I was shocked when I got to Colorado and accepted this job and said, you're in El Paso County now. So yes, that's El Paso County, Colorado. And Colorado Springs Utilities serves some of those communities. In addition, Colorado Springs Utilities also serves four of the five military installations in Colorado Springs. So you think about Colorado Springs, you think of the Air Force Academy, you think of NORAD, you think of Northcom, you think of those commands. And we were fortunate to privileged from a national security perspective to work with those organizations. The point I'm getting at, though, is while as Deputy Commissioner of Emergency Management in the city, I'm responsible to the community. I'm responsible to the community in a utility in a different way. We have to make sure that their lifeline services are up and running and maintained. So that has to do with preparedness, sustainability, continuity, and recovery, because lifeline services, so unlike in the business sector where you might have a business continuity plan and you'll identify, that old maximum allowable downtime. Well, I learned day one that there is no allowable downtime in an electric utility.
Yeah.
People die if they don't have electricity. Hospitals fail to operate, etc. So I could go on about that, but those are your principal differences.
Oh no, completely understandable. And when and I lived in Colorado Springs for about a year and a half.
I saw
I worked
that.
for the P I worked for the PD out there as a public information officer. And I'll tell you, one of the things that you realize is a lot of I lived in an apartment, so almost all the everything in the apartment was electric. There was no natural gas line to it. So if we didn't have power, I could do nothing. There no internet, no
Yeah,
phone, nothing, because it was all
yeah,
electrical based. So yeah, it was a real interesting thing. A couple times we had a short power outage, and one of it was because we had a wildfire and they had to bring a grid down and shift the grid over, and that was fine. But it's amazing work what that utility does and how much it handles in that community. And Colorado Springs is growing rapidly. They have Space Command there too now, and it's Fort Carson. The amount of military personnel that is in that city now is just astronomical, and they just continue to grow.
yeah. I had an incredible relationship with Colorado Springs Police and Fire Departments as a utility. And you're right, the Colorado Springs Utilities is very much ingrained in and is part of the community in any sense of the imagination. And being an emergency manager for such a great organization and having the opportunity to work with such a talented team and coordinate with emergency managers in the region, such as the El Paso County Regional Office of Emergency Management and the OEMs at the universities, the emergency managers at the military commands, was invigorating.
I bet. All right, so you have served in a lot of leadership positions in emergency management, both public and private sectors over the years. How has that experience in the public sector formed your approach to consulting in the private sector?
I think the principles and practices of emergency management in the public sector directly apply to the private sector. May smell a little different, may look a little different, but it works very well. And if you think about the main components of an emergency management program, developing and understanding threats and risks, developing and understanding and intelligence and situational awareness capability, developing and managing a crisis communications capability, building out an emergency operations program that is integrated. It's very similar. That stuff is directly transferable to the private sector. Well, Colorado Springs Utilities was a public sector organization. It was an enterprise of the city. It wasn't a city department. So we managed it a little bit like a private sector organization. So I had the opportunity to have an emergency operations center. And as an example, one of the things we did was we established a MAC, multi-agency coordination group, when we would have a major emergency and invite our public sector partners in. So I recall an incident where we had a water disruption and we had members of the surrounding emergency management communities, as well as the state, right there with us.
Outstanding. One of the things that I find interesting about the private sector is they will spend a lot of money on security, but they're always, when it comes to like planning for contingencies, like emergency management things and so on, and then even doing the training, that's kind of like where a lot of private sector organizations kind of fall off the ladder, in my opinion.
So I've experienced that, and some organizations won't even invest in security. Especially a for-profit organization that has an obligation to generate profits for shareholders, etc. They look at groups like security, risk, crisis management, business continuity as cost centers, not revenue generating parts of the
Yeah, you're,
business.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so
Then
that's a real challenge there.
it's a very unfortunate because I think if they would look at it as don't even look at it the cost factor, think of it of the survivability of your business, like you said, your business continuity. If they don't have those, here, I'll give you a great example. One of the former municipalities I worked for years ago that I retired from, they had ransomware hit them. They lost everything. So they lost the ability to get access to anything. And that included being able to pay their staff. And they didn't have anything in contingency for that. They did not have a plan to address it. And then when they had the opportunity to pay the ransomware to unlock their system, they didn't do it. So they literally had to rebuild everything from scratch. And
You,
go back to, I think it was a year behind that they didn't have digital records that had been stored.
During my time in Colorado, there was a statewide ransomware attack on the Colorado Department of Transportation. I'm telling you this story, Robert, because this answers your question to some extent about principles, using emergency management principles for different things. So the DOT took a direct hit. They had the loss of thousands of desktop machines, the ability to collect tolls, the ability to control variable message signs. It was a really catastrophic event. So the state emergency management director and the chief information security officer of the state teamed up and worked with the governor to have the governor declare a state of emergency for a cybersecurity incident. Not heard of, right? And what does that do? It's not just an empty declaration that comes with the ability to stand up an emergency operations center and stand up a cyber response operations center. And two centers are now working in cohesion to do two things. One is to identify the failure points and build a restoration capability and start recovering the system. But the other part of the business, and this is the emergency management side of the business, has to start working to coordinate the impacts. What are the impacts of the attack and messaging? And this comes back to having a strong PIO as part of your crisis management team. So with this really broad impact and statewide impact that the DOT experienced, having the ability to manage it through using incident management structure and architecture, an emergency management program, and having the ability to communicate directly to the public using strong PIOs was part of what made it a success.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that. In your experience, what were some of the most important lessons that you learned throughout your career in emergency management, and how did you apply them to work at the Kuhr Group?
So the first thing I'd like to say in answer to that question is that emergency management is a people-first enterprise. And as a people-first enterprise, that means that everything we do, everything we look at from a threat and risk perspective to the development of a crisis response and recovery capability has to focus on the people. By the way, that directly applies to the private sector. Certainly in the public sector, you would think of an answer such as that because we're responding to the human and humanitarian aspects of a disaster. But the first and most important asset in any organization, for profit or otherwise, is the workforce, is the human element. And so that's critical right there. And I learned that works in the public and private sector. Because if your people are taken care of, they'll take care of you during a disaster, and that's simply part of it. So when we work with organizations on a consulting perspective, we start that way. We'll look at threats and risks, and we'll categorize them based on impact to the human element, to the workforce. We'll categorize them based on impact to to production, to manufacturing, on a manufacturing site, production, communications. It really depends on what the organization does. But what is the impact on finance, the impact on the ability to ensure a sustained supply chain? By the way, you used a term that we're starting to use more regularly. I so appreciate that you didn't use the term resilience yet, because it's become a little burnt out. And
Yes.
what we're starting to do in the emergency management side, especially for private sector, is to talk about survivability. So kudos to you for using that term, because a business can be, I can stand in front of you, Mr. CEO, and talk about resilience all day long. You will understand business survivability. It's really a matter of terminology, but it's simple.
Yeah. No, I agree 100%. I've never been a big fan of there's two words that drive me nuts. Transparency and resiliency are the two words that I have issues with, because we throw transparency around all the time and there's really limited amount of it. And then, well, the other one is a phrase. It's the out of abundance of caution. I always love that phrase as well. So that's one, every time I hear that I cringe and I'm like, just, find a new word. Find a new word.
But we are using transparency, though, on crisis communications consulting, because businesses still don't understand the fact that they need to communicate well in a transparent manner. And if as soon as you, I know you know this, but as soon as you give a whiff of sidestepping the truth or twisting some information, you're done for.
Well, I tell you what. So yesterday I interviewed a PR person. Her name's Molly McPherson. She does these very high-profile reviews of incidents that had happened that day or whatever. She had done the one for Jay Z, and one of the things that she noticed about Jay Z is that he never actually denied the accusation. He attacked the lawyer. He attacked the way he dressed. He said, make if there's a charge, go ahead and file the charges, knowing full well that the statute of limitations ran out. He never actually came out and categorically said, I never did this. This never happened. And he implied it, but he never said it.
That's interesting.
And that to her was very telling. And that goes the same way with me. When when you're not telling the whole truth, or as much as you possibly can, the public's going to pick up on that.
No question about it. I mean, there are so many instances, and some of the big ones, the BP oil spill. Man, that always comes up, when that CEO basically said, I just want my life back. While people are suffering, and
Yeah.
there's
People have died.
people died, and there's dead oil covered animals floating up on beaches. That was tough stuff.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the whole, when management does not take care of its people and does not take care of its constituents, that comes out. Like you said, if you have you're taking care of your employees, you're keeping them informed, which I think is extremely important in an emergency, before they hear it on the news or before they hear it from a third party. If they're hearing it from you, they're more likely to, like you said, to do more for you and to buy and to continue the work that needs to be done, as opposed to, I don't know what's going on. We don't hear anything until we see it on the news.
If you allow a group of people or constituency, what have you, to not have as frequent information that you can provide to them, and they do hear it on the news first, they're going to think you're hiding something from them. I've seen that. People are going to get pretty upset.
Absolutely. Stephen, can you discuss any specific examples where a crisis communication played a real pivotal role in successfully managing a crisis?
So I think it comes back to 2017. So I'm back in Colorado now for my story. In
Mm-hmm.
2017, we had a bomb cyclone blizzard. Scientifically, that's known as a bombogenesis blizzard. And that is, in simple terms, where the barometric pressure drops at least 24 millibars in 24 hours. And we essentially experienced an inland hurricane. Now, in Colorado, we were not unaccustomed to severe winter weather. We were not unaccustomed to blizzard conditions, snow squalls, pretty Pretty bad stuff, especially where Colorado Springs is located at the base of the foothills and the beginning of the Great Plains. Everybody knows, well, I learned quickly, I should say,
So
that
did
a
I.
springtime Colorado blizzard is deadly, is catastrophic. So in March of 2017, we had a bomb cyclone blizzard, and I was at the utility at this time, and this is pre-pandemic, we just started using remote technologies, and we put them to work that day because we had safety issues bringing people to work. As a utility, very safety conscious. So we let a lot of people stay home, including a lot of members of the crisis management team, and we did some of this stuff remotely. But one thing that we were able to do was ensure that the community, our customers, if you will, it's important that we call them customers. Maybe if every government agency considered their constituents customers, because they do pay taxes, maybe they would look at things a little differently. We had probably at one point about half of our customer base out of power. The wind conditions were extreme. It was essentially an inland hurricane, uh, probably category 2 status. We clocked winds at the Colorado Springs airport over 100 miles per hour. So we had power outages, especially in the areas of the city where we had overhead line, and that was probably downtown, a little to the east and south of where you lived or worked. At least I know where the police operations center was. And the one thing that we were able to do is make sure that we had consistent, ongoing information delivered to the community about the power outages. So, one of the ways that we did this was in our incident command structure. I learned very quickly that, especially because we're dealing with a customer base, I wanted to have our PIOs very close to the action. So in our command center, where you would otherwise see the PIOs at their own table doing their own thing, they had a place to work, but we positioned our PIOs directly adjacent to and in between command and operations. So they didn't have to dig for the information, they were part of the conversation. So when our corporate communications group, a really solid team of PIOs, got the information, it was cleared up the chain, including through myself as a command center manager, and then up through our CEO. But it was all kind of organized that way.
All right. So, Stephen, those communication challenges and stuff, do they differ when you're dealing with a crisis in like a sector like transportation versus an energy sector?
It can, and that depends on whether the situation has life-threatening implications. So we're working in the energy sector right now. Kuhr Group is working in the energy sector right now. And one of the concerns that we're dealing with is the ability to communicate during a crisis to adjacent communities, because some of the infrastructure of this organization have what we would call a fence line right in the community. They are a neighbor of the community, and the facilities that this organization operates, produces chemicals, and some could be seen as hazards. There might be a fire threat, a threat of a spill and stuff like that. From a transportation perspective, and I have some experience in transportation as well, it depends what's going on. If you have, if the transportation we're talking about can generate a significant community hazard, such as, let's say, a railroad has an accident, propane tanks, car explodes, levee occurs. That's probably an extreme scenario, but let's just say railroads having delays and stuff like that. Delays are an inconvenience, but they're not life threatening. So I think it really depends on what the situation is.
Okay. So, Stephen, then drawing on your experience, what are some of the pitfalls that organizations make in their crisis communications, and how can those be avoided?
Well, and I've seen this so often, and I saw this just recently in one of the listeria contamination events. I don't recall which organization it was, so I wouldn't call them out by name even if I did, but they went silent. So the first negative thing is going silent. And now you are generating a situation of, you're suspect now. What are you hiding? Why aren't you talking to the people? Or they provide limited information or very scripted information or information that has corporate jargon that the community might not understand. So I think those are some of the major pitfalls. Information has to be delivered at a readability level. So if if it would be something, here's my rule of thumb: if if it would be beyond the ability of someone to read the New York Post or the New York Daily News, then it's probably has too much scientific or corporate jargon in it. Kind of a rule of thumb there.
Yeah, no, I agree. One of the other things what something came to mind as I was thinking about one of the most recent incidents involving one of the meat companies that had some food that was contaminated. It wasn't listeria, I forget what it was. But one of the things that came out of that is that they had a factory where production was done. It was utterly contaminated with,
Yeah, I know which one you're
so
talking about.
yeah, and as a result, their level of communication that was coming out about that and what they were going to do and how they were going to improve was delayed by weeks, to the point where I was at the grocery store and I saw people like, "No, I don't want that. I'm gonna take this other stuff and make a purchase of other stuff as opposed to that."
I can't imagine that this. So I'm not tracking this, but I can't imagine that this company that has a national footprint is not suffering on the revenue side of things. I think there could have been. This is not the company I was thinking of before, but this is an organization that probably no definitely needed a better communications, crisis communications infrastructure. And I mean, I'm going to go on a limb here and say the lawyers need to be part of crisis communications, but the lawyers also have to understand the nuance of communicating with the customer base and making sure the messages get out there. If holding statements should be pre-authorized, and that should give you some time to get the team together to develop
Yep,
appropriate
absolutely.
releases and hold press conferences. But yeah, you can that's the going silent thing I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Stephen, the Kuhr Group helps clients develop crisis management plans. How does the Kuhr Group integrate crisis communications into those plans?
So I have a saying, and this directly applies into the development of my plan. Actually have a bunch of sayings or Kurisms, if you will, aphorisms, if you will. The first one is never walk into a crisis management center without a PIO at your side. And I mean that sincerely. And that means that I believe strongly in, beg your pardon, transparent, frequent, accurate information to the public, to your customer base, to your political upline, whatever it is. Because as soon as you give the appearance of covering up or hiding something, you've lost the game at that point. The point is that all of our programs have crisis communications at the fore. Now we use, for the most part, standard emergency management infrastructure, as we discussed earlier, for the development of crisis management plans, even in the private sector. And as much as those plans include a public information function, I raise it I raise it to the top because the ability to communicate, it's not just the public, it's not just standing in a microphone. If I have a command center, we're running an operation, and my PIO or public information team is right there at the operations table, and somebody needs information for an elected official or somebody in the C-suite, that individual can communicate that information because they're part of it. And by the way, I'd rather have a PIO draft the message than somebody in operations, because those are people that need to focus on managing the response and ensuring recovery. And plus, people that are in public information roles are best suited to develop an appropriate message that's well articulated.
I agree. And one of the things that I see that happens is a lot of times the PIO is an afterthought. It's an ancillary job
See,
responsibility
that's
for,
such a mistake.
yeah. It's because it's always looked at as a secondary. And I see a lot of law enforcement agencies, especially the smaller ones, that do not have a dedicated PIO, that it's a sergeant or something filling in for that position part-time. They don't necessarily have the background to do it. And there was There was an incident a couple of years ago in Georgia where a PIO got up and spoke, and it became very detrimental to not only his career but to the investigation that was going on. And so, you've really got to make sure you have properly trained people, people that are very experienced in dealing with the media and dealing with messaging, but also that they're not hindered by another responsibility.
Yeah, and it really can't be a second-hatted job. It can't be somebody that's wearing dual hats. It has to be a professional. Messaging, developing appropriate messages and coordinating with the media is not a bad thing. In fact, the press is your friend. To the extent that we have mass communication technologies today, well, that's all well and good, but it is so much better to put an elected official or a high ranking official in front of the camera and have them provide a briefing and let them take questions. I believe that gives the human factor and lets people calm down a little bit. So if your organization is pushing out mass communication messages through technology means like emergency alert system, etc., so be it. But that needs to be followed up with really kind of elemental press conferences as long as the people are well briefed. And that's only done by a strong PIO.
I agree 100% there, sir. Thank you. Let's change this up to some rapid fire questions.
Let's do it.
All right, here you go. Texting or talking?
Texting.
Movies or books?
Books.
Coffee, tea, or energy drink?
If anybody knows me knows that I am an absolute coffee addict. I got my
There you,
espresso right here. And
there you go.
yeah, I have a saying, one of my Kerrisms, a good command post deserves a good cup of coffee.
Absolutely. Adult drink of choice?
Wine. I actually have an education in wine studies. Some midlife crisis thing I did at the Culinary Institute of America.
Nice.
I went out to the Napa Valley campus and sat through a wine immersion, took an exam, and I actually have a certificate as a wine professional.
Excellent. That's a nice sideline there. What would be your superpower if you could have one?
I'd have to think about that. I guess it would be, for me, it always comes back to the team. It's really not about me. So I guess it would be the ability, to pull in a team, possibly a divergent team, and develop a unity of action, unity of response, unity of effort, that kind of thing.
Excellent. Ask permission or beg for forgiveness?
Beg for forgiveness, absolutely. There's no time. Make a decision. If you are unable to make a decision, you don't belong in this business.
What place do you most want to travel to?
Well, I'm the wine guy. I need to get to Tuscany. I've been to Italy, but I have not been to the Tuscan region yet.
Yeah, there you go. That wine would be good there. What's your favorite way to relax after a long day?
Just dinner with my wife. She has an innate understand. We're married quite a while, 3 decades plus. She understands. She's not from my professional world, but she understands it. She's integrated well with it, and she's just a place I can dump on.
Nice.
She
Nothing but a good woman behind somebody that support them that makes them even better. Absolutely. Who would you choose if you could sit down and have coffee with any historical figure, living or dead?
John Fitzgerald Kennedy comes to mind, and I'll tell you why. The ultimate crisis, no, not the ultimate disaster. Disasters are disasters. The ultimate crisis and the way in which the Cuban Missile Crisis was managed from a political, from a front of what's the word I'm trying to look for? Sort of a back channel operation, but yet also
Mm-hmm.
having your crisis management team, because there was a crisis management team called the XCOM, Executive Committee of the National Security Council. The XCOM was your frontline crisis communications room, and I would love to. I wish there were tapes because I would love to understand that, because there are tremendous lessons learned there. But there's also the back channel where Robert Kennedy worked with the ambassador from the Soviet Union to remove the Jupiter rockets out of Turkey, which led to the Russian missiles being removed from Cuba. If you understand any of that, you understand crisis management in an abstract way, because sometimes you need to use the back channel in crisis management too, because people have agendas, and there's a way to manage a crisis by allowing them to have to meet their agenda and not look like they gave something up.
Great point there, sir. Appreciate that. Final thoughts. What key points would you like our listeners to take from today's interview?
Crisis management and crisis communications must be united in every way. So we kind of spoke about that. So in policy, in plans, and especially in practice.
Outstanding. Stephen, as we wrap this up, is there a piece of wisdom or a motto that you live by?
So a couple more Kurisms, and this applies to crisis communications. One, everyone has a seat at the table. And I have driven staffs in different jobs that I've had, in different leadership roles I've had, crazy, because everyone needs to have a seat at the table, because you never know who has that widget that they can offer, whether it's a policy, a program, a piece of equipment, or a tool. And by the way, if somebody wants a seat at my table, they get it simply because there's an element of respect there. And I've seen that where you develop a program where you hold these meetings and you don't invite everybody. I'll go back real quick to the World Trade Center, 9/11, and this is a much bigger story, but in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which I was privileged to have a part of, the New York City Fire Department was the incident commander, and every morning at Engine 7, Ladder 1, they took the equipment off the apparatus floor and set up tables. And we held a 7 a.m. or 7:30 interagency command meeting with well over 100 people. That's because the chief of department, it was Frank Crothers, understood that everybody needed a seat at the table. And I was privileged to have one of those seats. But was it unruly? Was there mayhem sometimes? Not as much as you think, but yet it had to be done. Everybody has a seat at the table. The other one is, and you'll get this right away, when in doubt, shout it out. People often withhold information or they're afraid to send out information. Listen, people have died in the emergency management business because information is not being sent. I'm not going to pick on Maui. Well, guess I am, right? So during the wildfires a year and
Yep.
change ago, there was a lack of information. There's been several other scenarios, wildfire scenarios, where information wasn't sent or wasn't received. So if you have to think about sending information, send it. And by the way, it comes back to something we spoke about earlier. Ask for forgiveness later.
Absolutely. Stephen, how can people best reach out to you if they want to connect or follow up on anything they heard today?
I have a big presence on LinkedIn. I'm happy to engage with anybody. You can find me, shoot me a PM on LinkedIn.
And I will add your link into the show notes. Stephen Kuhr, thank you very much for being on the show.
My great pleasure. Great conversation.
Awesome conversation. And you have a great day, sir.